Hello everyone. Welcome to the first part of What If Deku Had a Stand. If you enjoy, please like and subscribe. I did not write this story. The original writer is Dace the Elderly Tripper. Please check them out despite the deranged username. Now let's dive in. It is a rule of nature that evolution cannot be stopped. It is the driving force that shapes and molds every living being, from the tiniest microbe to the mightiest mammal. And yet, in this world, evolution took a turn that no one could have predicted. As humans, we have always prided ourselves on our intelligence and ingenuity. We believed that we had reached the pinnacle of our development, that there was no further room for improvement. And yet, every day, more and more of us were born with a gift that surpassed anything we had ever known. A glowing baby, born with a power beyond our comprehension, was just the beginning. As more and more people began to develop their own unique abilities, we found ourselves in a world that was both wondrous and terrifying. At first, we called these abilities quirks, but as they became more and more commonplace, they simply became a part of who we were. But what of those who were born without these gifts? The quirkless, as they were called, were the last remnants of a forgotten era, an era when people were content with what they were given. They were looked down upon by those who had been blessed with these abilities, as if they were somehow less worthy. It is a cruel and unfair world that we live in, where those who are given advantages are praised for them, while those who are not are left to struggle. And yet, this is the way of nature. The strong survive, while the weak are left behind. But there is a new step in human history, a step that is being taken by those who did not have a choice. Do you believe in gravity? It is a force that cannot be seen, but we know that it is there. In the same way, the power of evolution is unseen, but it is a force that we cannot deny. And as we move forward into this new era, we must remember that adaptation is key. Those who can adapt will thrive, while those who cannot will be left behind. Izuku Midoriya's heart was racing as he stumbled back against the wall, his breaths coming in short gasps. His eyes widened in shock and fear as he stared unblinking at the figure standing nonchalantly in his room. How had the man gotten in? The lock on his front door was still secure. His mind raced with questions and possibilities, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that washed over him like a cold wave. He had just come back from the doctor's office, where he had been told that he would never have a quirk. Tears still stained his red t-shirt, a reminder of the crushing disappointment and hopelessness he had felt. And now this. An unknown person, or perhaps something else entirely, stood before him, its skull-like face and war bonnet adorned with feathers and a purple jewel seeming to mock his lack of power. It wore yellow robes with red roses on its chest, and gray armor on its arms and legs. For a moment, Izuku couldn't move, couldn't even find his voice. As his mother, Inko Midoriya, approached his room, her heart quickened with worry. She was a slender woman with the same vibrant green hair in a neat ponytail, and she had been anxious about her son ever since she learned he was quirkless. But the utter silence coming from his room was even more alarming. When she pushed open the door, her heart broke into a million pieces. There was her beautiful, kind son, trembling on the ground with terror etched on his face, his body pressed tightly against the wall. Without hesitation, she rushed towards him, dropping to her knees and enveloping him in a tight hug. But he didn't respond, didn't hug her back. He was still staring unblinkingly, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. Tears streamed down her face as she repeated, "I'm so sorry, Izuku. I'm so sorry." She didn't know what had happened to her son, but she knew that something had broken him. The entity kept his grin on his face, his vibrant green eyes clashing with Izuku's own, as if daring him to do something. Izuku felt a chill run down his spine, his heart racing as he tried to back away, but found himself frozen in place. The entity seemed to be enjoying his fear, relishing in it as it continued to stare him down. "Go away," was all Izuku could repeat in his head, his voice trembling with each syllable. He could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, his palms slick with it as he tried to find a way to escape this terrifying situation. But by some unknown miracle, the entity suddenly vanished into thin air, leaving Izuku alone with his mother who hadn't stopped crying since she found him. Her tears were like raindrops on his skin, her sobs echoing in his ears as she held him tight, apologizing over and over again. And finally, after holding it in for so long, Izuku cried with her, letting out all the fear and pain that had been building up inside of him. It was only in the next morning that Izuku knew he wasn't dreaming about the events of last night, of the entire day. He had hoped that it was just a nightmare, but the reality was just as bleak as before. He was quirkless, there was no way to make it not sound like an insult. Like he was a handicapped person. His strength seemed to leave him as he remained in his bed, knuckles gripping his bedsheets hard. Yesterday he felt utter despair and hopelessness in his eyes. Now, the only thing that he felt was sadness and an eerie emptiness. Collecting all his positive energy and summoning his determination, he sat up in his bed, ready to face another day. But as soon as his eyes scanned the room, he immediately froze, regretting ever waking up. The thing was there again, across his bed. Right at the door. Staring at him. This time, Izuku didn't feel fear as much, still enough to freeze him, as he felt a burning curiosity. He had so many questions that he wanted to ask, but his mouth was dry and his throat was tight. He took a deep breath and managed to croak out, Who are you? Why are you here? The figure stood there, unmoving and unresponsive to Izuku's presence. Even when his all-might alarm began blaring across the room, the figure remained motionless, making no attempt to silence the obnoxious noise. A foolish thought crossed Izuku's mind, and he couldn't help but voice it aloud. Excuse me, could you maybe? He trailed off, pointing towards the blaring alarm. He immediately regretted his words. What was he thinking? There was a strange man in his room, the same one who had been there the day before, and here he was trying to make small talk. Izuku chided himself for his sudden urge to socialize, especially with someone who seemed so ominous and menacing. To Izuku's utter surprise, the man swiftly and silently moved in front of the blaring all-might alarm, silencing it with one bony finger. Izuku gulped, the man's back exposed to him. He tried to distract himself by observing the man's unusual choice of clothing. Were those sewn-on music notes and real feathers? Desperate for the man to do anything besides stand there, Izuku heard footsteps approaching. Before he could say anything, his mother burst into the room. Izuku, at this rate you're going to be late for dash. She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening at the sight of her son's terrified expression. Her heart sank, and she could feel the tears welling up in her eyes. You don't have to go today, Izuku. Just rest for a while, she said softly, before closing the door and walking away, her footsteps fading into silence. Izuku stared at the closed door for a long moment, his mouth hanging open in shock. How had his mother not noticed the tall, strange man standing in the room with them? He turned back to the man, his fear growing stronger. With a shaking hand, he grabbed one of his notebooks from his nightstand and threw it at the figure. To his horror, the book simply phased right through the man's body, knocking the alarm clock off the desk in the process. Izuku felt his panic intensify, wishing the man once again vanished like last night. And just like last night, although now less obscured by the darkness, the man became translucent in a matter of milliseconds. In a sudden rush of terror, the man's translucent form flew towards him. Izuku let out a shrill scream, shielding his face with his elbow as if that would make the apparition disappear. After what felt like an eternity, he opened his eyes again. The man had vanished just as quickly as he appeared, leaving Izuku feeling both relieved and uneasy. He slowly climbed out of bed, taking care to scan his room for any sign of the mysterious figure. There was nothing. He let out a long exhale, relieved to be alone again. Approaching his alarm clock, he picked it up and checked it for any damage, relieved to find that it was still functioning properly. But the encounter with the strange man left Izuku with more questions than answers. What did he want? And why was he haunting him? And before he could try to answer any of these questions, footsteps once again reminded him of the other person in his home. His door opened and a worried head of a mother peeked in, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of trouble. Upon finding her son, she spoke with a gentle tone, Izuku, come on, let's go eat breakfast. Izuku slowly nodded, his mind still reeling from the strange encounter he had just experienced. As he dressed himself and prepared to leave the room, he couldn't help but cast a nervous glance over his shoulder. The room was empty, but the feeling of unease lingered. Izuku took a deep breath and closed the door behind him, locking it with trembling fingers. As he walked down the hallway towards the kitchen, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It had been months since the strange man appeared in Izuku's room, and the experience had taken a toll on him. Not only did he have to deal with the constant fear of the man's presence, but he also had to endure the bullying of the other kids in his kindergarten. Katsuki Bakugu, the hot-headed boy from Izuku's kindergarten group, was the worst of them all. He taunted Izuku for his quirklessness, making him the laughingstock of the class. Despite this, Izuku was grateful that Katsuki at least talked to him, unlike the other kids who completely shunned him. One day, while on a walk in the forest, Katsuki slipped on a log and fell into the river. Izuku, trying to be helpful, offered his hand to help him up. But Katsuki, in a fit of anger, slapped Izuku's hand away and insulted him for his quirklessness before storming off with the other kids. Izuku stood in the cold river for what felt like an eternity, his feet freezing in the icy water. It wasn't until his mother's panicked shouts broke through his daze that he realized how long he had been standing there. He had developed a high fever that lasted for days, with doctors amazed at how severe it was considering the circumstances. The experience left Izuku feeling more isolated than ever, his physical and emotional pain too much to bear. It didn't help that Izuku spent most of his days in the sterile hospital room, hooked up to various machines that beeped and whirred, monitoring his every breath and heartbeat. The rhythmic sound of the machines had become a sort of background noise to Izuku, but it was a constant reminder of just how fragile his body was. But then there was the man, the mysterious figure that had been haunting him since his visit to the doctor. At first, the sight of him had sent Izuku into a panic, but over time, his fear had turned into a strange sort of comfort. It was as if the man was there to take care of him, to watch over him while he slept and make sure he had everything he needed. Izuku couldn't explain how or why, but he felt like he could trust the man. And so, as the days stretched on and Izuku's condition slowly improved, he found himself talking to the man more and more. At first, it was just simple things, asking for water or a blanket, but soon enough, Izuku found himself confiding in the man, telling him about his fears and worries, his hopes and dreams. To his surprise, the man listened. Not with his ears, of course, he didn't even have those, but with his eyes, which seemed to sparkle with a strange sort of understanding. As Izuku talked, he began to realize that the man was more than just a figment of his imagination. There was something deeper there, something that connected them in a way that he couldn't quite explain. And so, as he lay there in his hospital bed, surrounded by machines and sterile walls, Izuku found solace in the company of the man. It was a strange comfort, but it was one that he clung to fiercely, knowing that without it, he would be truly alone. It didn't matter that the man didn't speak back, or even have a mouth to speak with. Izuku found comfort in the fact that he could confide in someone, even if that someone was a skeletal figure with glowing eyes. As he talked, he began to feel like the man was listening, really listening. He began to notice subtle nods and gestures that seemed to indicate understanding, and it made him feel less alone. Over time, Izuku's conversations with the man grew more meaningful. He began to talk about his hopes and dreams for the future, about the things he wanted to do when he finally got out of the hospital. It was a strange, almost surreal experience, but it made Izuku feel like he had a friend, someone who truly cared about him. And as he slowly recovered from his illness, Izuku found himself looking forward to the moments when the man would come to visit. It was a strange sort of companionship, but it was one that had gotten him through some of the darkest days of his life. If it weren't for the times the man had physically interacted with the environment around him, Izuku would have thought that his mind finally snapped and conjured an extension of his psyche to deal with the isolation he had experienced for the last few days. But the man's actions were too real, too tangible, to be a mere figment of his imagination. As Izuku lay in his bed, he watched as the man moved about the room, retrieving a water bottle and fixing his blanket. It was like the man had become his own personal caretaker, always there to attend to his every need. But what was even more strange was the fact that no one seemed to notice the man's presence. Not the nurses or doctors, not even his own mother when she came to visit. It was as if he was invisible to everyone but Izuku. As the days passed, Izuku's condition slowly improved. His fever had subsided, and he was finally able to sit up and move around. And yet, even as he got better, the man's presence never wavered. He was still there, always watching, always listening. It was then that Izuku realized that the man was more than just a caretaker. He was a friend, a companion in his time of need. And even as he prepared to leave the sterile hospital room and return to the outside world, Izuku knew that he would never forget the strange, skull-faced man who had helped him through his darkest days. As life went on, he had learned to accept his quirklessness, having long given up the hope that it was just a late manifestation. He decided to attend a public school and his first interaction with his peers went smoothly. However, things took a turn for the worse when the teacher asked everyone to introduce themselves. As it came time for him to speak, he mustered up the courage to share that he had no quirk, hoping to be met with understanding and friendliness. Unfortunately, as soon as the words left his mouth, hushed whispers and snickers erupted among the students. The teacher quickly silenced them and gestured for the next person to introduce themselves. During lunch break, he soon realized that the once friendly students now wanted nothing to do with him. They either ignored his attempts at conversation, left the table when he sat down, or even snapped at him outright. It was a harsh reality that he was now facing, one that made him feel even more isolated and alone. In the next few days, things didn't seem to improve for him at school, but his outlook on the situation did. He no longer expected anyone to sit with him during lunch or for the teachers to intervene on his behalf during disturbances. He also prepared himself mentally for sports games, where he was often accidentally hit during play. After a full week of school, he came home and let out a deep sigh, closing the door to his room behind him. As he began to open his school bag to start his homework, a strange noise caught his attention. Looking up, he saw the man, his grin and eyeless feature as present as it was in the hospital. His heart skipped a beat as a small smile spread across Izuku's face. Hey there. I'm sorry for not talking in a while. And not that I don't want you here, I don't even know where you come from or how to contact you since you don't even have a phone. But I'm really happy to see you again. Izuku continued to chatter away, talking about anything and everything as he unpacked his school supplies and began his homework. Despite the challenges he was facing at school, this unexpected visit brought him a sense of comfort and ease, even if it did leave him a bit flustered. The man continued to stand by Izuku's side, silently helping him with small tasks like retrieving a book out of reach or pouring him a glass of water. After Izuku had finished his homework, he delved into his hobby of analyzing heroes and their quirks, passionately rambling on about quirks. Furiously scribbling away in a fresh notebook labeled Hero Analysis for the Future, he wrote down every detail about quirks that caught his attention. At the moment, he was studying an Italian hero with the ability to communicate with animals and use them as companions in battle. Meanwhile, the man simply stood and observed, occasionally glancing over Izuku's shoulder but otherwise remaining motionless. When Izuku's mother entered the room to check on him, she found him sound asleep with the notebook still open on his desk and the lamp casting a soft glow on his green hair. She couldn't help but chuckle at her son's dedication and picked him up, carrying him to his bed and tucking him in with his blankets. As she closed the door, she didn't notice the blankets shifting on their own before settling into a more comfortable position for Izuku, who let out a contented sigh in his sleep. As the weeks turned into months, the man hardly left Izuku's side, and the young boy was grateful for his company. He didn't care if the man was just a figment of his imagination or a hallucination. He was just happy to have a friend. However, people around him began to notice his tendency to talk to himself. Kids at school started saying that he had mentally snapped, and teachers even addressed the problem with his mother. Izuku tried to reduce the amount of times he talked to Grim, as he called the man, as much as possible. Despite this, he continued to work diligently on his schoolwork and became the top student in his class. This infuriated Katsuki, who started bullying him. It started with verbal insults, but then things turned physical. The first time Katsuki attacked Izuku behind the school, something drastically changed. "Deku, you fucking nerd!" Katsuki shouted before pulling his fist back. As he was about to hit the young boy, something stopped him. Katsuki looked down at his fist, which was mid-air, and felt a larger hand pressing against his lower arm with considerable force, making his arm shake. Izuku locked up in shock, but he didn't feel any pain. He saw that Grim was stopping Katsuki's fist with one hand. Katsuki growled angrily, "Deku, if you don't turn your fucking quirk off, I will use my own." Stop it." Izuku yelled out to Grim, but he was ignored. In the deepest, darkest part of his subconscious, he didn't want Grim to stop gripping his arm. He would rather have him keep him safe. Katsuki, thinking the scream was addressed to him, only saw more red. "So finally growing a damn spine are we?" "It's too late for that," he shouted, sparking a small flame in his hand before it exploded with his sweat. Izuku flinched and tried to jump back, his mind racing with fear. "Please don't let it hit me," he thought desperately. To his surprise, he found himself hurtling backward through the air, flying a distance of at least 14 meters before crashing to the ground. What?" he exclaimed, dazed and confused. Izuku looked around, searching for Grim, but the mysterious presence was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was a big blue boing sound effect located where he had been standing just moments before. He couldn't believe what had just happened, and his mind reeled with disbelief and confusion. "What the hell did you just do, Deku?" Katsuki asked, his voice surprisingly calm compared to his usual explosive anger. Izuku was taken aback by the change in tone. I don't know." Izuku stammered, still in shock from the sudden burst of power. Katsuki's temper flared once again. "What do you mean, you don't know? You think I believe this shit? Izuku backed away from Katsuki, his hands up in defense. I swear, I don't know. A lot of shouting later, an ominous threat from Katsuki and Izuku was walking back home again. Mid-walk, he heard the all-too-familiar sound of Grim appearing. He quickly looked up just to make sure, but equally quickly looked down again. After a long pause, Izuku finally mustered up the courage to speak. Grim, did you make me jump back there? To avoid the threat, he asked, turning to where Grim was standing. There was no response, and Izuku wasn't surprised. Grim never spoke, and even when he did communicate, most of the time just flashing his eyes more, it was usually so cryptic that Izuku struggled to understand. Still, he couldn't help feeling grateful to Grim. If it weren't for him, Izuku might have been hurt by Katsuki's outburst. Thank you, he said softly, for protecting me. I don't know what I'd do without you. Again, there was no response, but Izuku didn't mind. He didn't continue their conversation after that, simply enjoying the company. Before he knew it, he stood in front of his door already. I'm home. As soon as Izuku stepped into his home, he felt the weight of the day lift off his shoulders. He let out a deep sigh of relief and walked towards the kitchen, where he heard his mother shuffling around. Izuku. Dinner is almost ready? Are you all right? Inko asked, noticing her son's downcast expression. Izuku's forced smile faltered for a moment before he quickly regained his composure. Yeah, I'm fine, Mom. Just had a tough day at school, he replied, trying to sound convincing. Inko gave him a concerned look but didn't press any further. Okay, well, dinner will be ready in a few minutes. Take your time and freshen up if you need to, she said before turning back to the dinner. Izuku let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding and quickly made his way to his room. Once inside, he closed the door behind him and leaned his back against it. Izuku let out a heavy sigh and slumped onto his bed. He pulled out a familiar notebook from his backpack, the only difference being a new #2 hashtag at the end of the title. As he flipped through the pages, his mind was still preoccupied with the events of the day. You never told me about your quirk, he said, turning towards Grim. I always assumed it was your appearance and your, invisibility. He rubbed his neck, feeling a bit embarrassed. I've known you for months now, and I'm still not sure if you really exist. I mean, I know you can interact with the environment and all, but why can't anyone else see you? Grim remained silent, as he always did. Izuku sighed again, knowing he wouldn't get a response. He looked around his room, taking in the familiar surroundings. It was his sanctuary, the one place where he could be himself without fear of judgment. But even here, he couldn't escape the constant nagging of his quirklessness. It was a constant reminder of his limitations, of the things he could never achieve. He opened his notebook and began jotting down some ideas, hoping to distract himself from his thoughts. I wish I could show everyone that I have something to offer, he muttered to himself. Most people he told he was quirkless would simply nod and turn away after. But those who he interacted with for longer periods of time would notice the strange occurrences around him, pens writing on their own, objects flying towards him, and doors opening and closing seemingly on their own accord. Izuku didn't think much of it, because all he could see was Grim doing these things, not him. It wasn't until now that he realized Grim always seemed to know what he wanted before he even said anything. It was as if his ghostly companion could read his mind. This ability made it seem like Izuku had a telekinesis quirk, similar to his mother's. But he knew the truth, Grim was the source of these peculiar happenings. Whenever Izuku was confronted about the strange things happening around him, he would always explain that it was his invisible friend who had the ability, not him. But the more he talked about Grim, the more people began to avoid him. It wasn't until he spoke to his mother about Grim, which turned out to be an adventure in itself, that she suggested they go back to the doctor and update his registry to list telekinesis as his quirk. Izuku learned to keep his quirklessness and Grim a secret from others, as he was constantly met with skepticism and ridicule. His classmates continued to call him crazy and insane, while even his teacher seemed to distance himself from Izuku. It became easier for him to accept their misunderstanding rather than trying to explain the truth to them. He looked up, catching Grim looking over his shoulder. Can you do that again? He asked, eyes widening with curiosity. Grim walked towards a cup on Izuku's desk, one that he had forgotten to clean, and picked it up. He stared at it for a few seconds, as if considering something, before violently throwing it to the ground. The resulting sound was a loud slam that should have destroyed the cup beyond any hope of repair. As Izuku quickly tried to come up with an excuse for the loud noise, he heard his mother's voice calling out from behind the door. Is everything okay, Izuku? She asked with concern. Taking a deep breath, Izuku replied with a forced calmness, Yeah, Mom. I just tripped over a cup, but everything's fine. After he heard his mother's footsteps recede, he turned back to Grim, who had picked up the cup again. But this time, as Grim picked up the cup, Izuku noticed a small green kana stuck to it. Grim lazily threw the cup at Izuku's alarm, and everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Izuku watched as the cup slowly descended towards the clock, the green kana still attached to it. The impact was immediate and devastating. The glass face of the clock shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces, sending sharp fragments flying in every direction. The small plastic All Might figure perched on top of the alarm was flung to the ground, its limbs breaking off on impact. The protective plastic case housing the delicate interior folded in on itself as if it had been crushed by a powerful force. Izuku was left in utter shock, his mind racing with a million questions. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. His alarm clock, which had been with him for years, was now a pile of broken pieces. But he couldn't bring himself to be angry or upset about it, not when he had just witnessed Grim's power firsthand. He turned to Grim, who was still standing there, seemingly unaffected by the chaos he had just caused. Izuku's eyes were wide with wonder and amazement as he studied his invisible friend. He couldn't believe that all this time, Grim had been hiding such a powerful ability. He looked back at the destroyed alarm clock, then back at Grim. This went on for a few moments until he finally turned back to his notebook, determined to document Grim's quirk. He flipped open a brand new blank page and began to jot down his thoughts. Force manipulation, he wrote. No, probably storage. That makes more sense. Does he need to throw the object, or does any force suffice? Can force be already stored in an object? He paused for a moment, considering these questions before continuing to write. Does Grim have control over the stored force? Can he release it at will, or does it happen automatically? And if it happens automatically, what triggers it? Izuku's mind was buzzing with theories and ideas, and he scribbled them down as fast as he could. What about the green kana, he mused. Does it have any significance, or was it just a coincidence? He only stopped writing when his mother bursted through his door, yelling for the 5th time that dinner was ready. Izuku Midoriya could hardly contain his excitement as he sat on the old, rusty fridge. His heart was pounding with anticipation, his body shaking with the sheer thrill of it all. The smell of rotting garbage filled his nostrils, but he didn't care. All that mattered was the power he was witnessing. He looked around at the piles of broken electrical devices and other debris that surrounded him. It was a scene of chaos and destruction. Takoba Beach was really disgusting, but it was also the perfect place to witness Grim's incredible quirk. Izuku's mind raced with excitement as he scribbled down more entries on Grim's page in his notebook. Grim's power was not about storing physical force, but sounds. This was a game changer, and Izuku could barely contain his excitement. He had always been fascinated by quirks and their potential, but Grim's ability was on another level. It was versatile, practical, and had endless possibilities. Izuku couldn't wait to see what other surprises Grim had in store for him. He glanced over at Grim, who was standing next to him, invisible as always. He wondered what it would be like to have such a powerful quirk and what it would be like to use it. But for now, he was content to study and learn all he could about Grim's ability. Grim's quirk, sound storage, was truly remarkable. Izuku couldn't believe the possibilities that came with such an ability. He marveled at Grim's power, which was able to store any sound in an object and apply it to other things with the physical manifestation of the sounds, represented by the kanzas on the objects. The implications of this quirk were astounding. It meant that Grim could create a weapon out of any object by simply applying the sound of an explosion or a gunshot. But, like all quirks, it had its limitations. The only downside was that Grim had to be near the sound or create it himself. He couldn't create a sound out of nothing. However, he could still store sounds in objects if they were made in his radius by someone else. That was still pretty impressive. As Izuku scribbled away happily in his notebook, he didn't even spare a second glance at the chaos around him. The floor was littered with the broken remains of microwaves and other small appliances, all sacrificed in the name of his necessary research. He was so absorbed in his theories that he barely even noticed Grim strolling past with another microwave in hand, poised to smash it against the stairs. He didn't notice the plain blonde boy watching him from the streets, studying him curiously from afar. The boy looked both ways before crossing the street, then walked down the stairs. It wasn't until Izuku heard a loud, jarring smashing sound that he finally snapped out of his research-induced trance. His head swiveled around, searching for the source of the noise. That's when he saw the blonde boy, lying on the ground and groaning in pain. Izuku didn't waste any time. He jumped off the fridge, hastily stowing his precious notebooks away, and sprinted towards the injured boy. As he got closer, he noticed something peculiar, a tail protruding from the boy's back. The blonde boy was of a similar age to Izuku. His short hair was swept forward, and he wore a plain gray shirt, black shorts, and white sneakers. Izuku knelt down beside him, apologizing profusely as he tended to the boy's injuries. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know someone else was here. Are you okay? Do you need an ambulance? Is your back hurt? Are you okay?" Izuku's words came pouring out of his mouth without stopping. Until the boy slowly sat up again, letting out a groan before turning to him and saying, "Don't worry, I'm fine, man. It doesn't really hurt anymore." Masahiro Ojiro winced as a slight pinch spread through his back. "Although I'm surprised that it hurts more than when I usually fall." Quickly, Izuku put his arms up again, tears forming in his eyes. "That's my fault. If I wasn't so careless you wouldn't be injured. I am so sorry." His tears started to flow down his cheeks, causing Masahiro to feel a bit put off. It's all right. Here, see." Masahiro stood up without any hesitation, holding out his hand to help Izuku up. "I'm really fine. Masahiro Ojiro," he said, introducing himself. Izuku hesitated for a moment before accepting the offer and standing up. "Izuku Midoriya," he mumbled quietly, still wiping away his tears. As Ojiro walked around, taking in the destruction around them, he turned to Izuku and asked, "So Midoriya, what are you up to?" Izuku froze, feeling caught off guard. He had never expected someone to catch him in the act, let alone someone as strong-looking as Ojiro. I was just experimenting," he stumbled, not quite sure how to explain himself. Ojiro let out an impressed whistle. "With your quirk?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. Izuku hesitated. Yeah, my quirk," he finally admitted. Ojiro chuckled. "Did you use your quirk to break all these things, or did you do it the old-fashioned way with your fists?" he joked. Izuku blushed, realizing how silly he must have looked punching a microwave. "No, it was my quirk," he replied, feeling embarrassed. Ojiro nodded, understanding. "That's pretty cool. What does your quirk do, exactly?" This was the longest he had a normal conversation with someone that wasn't his mother probably. He really didn't want to lie, really he didn't. He heard the cranking sound again, Grim appearing next to Ojiro who was patiently waiting for him to finish. One look at Grim, his eyes flashing brighter than usual, and he steeled his nerves. "Sound storage." Grim's light lit up once again, this time brighter, before reappearing beside Izuku, not catching Ojiro's attention. "Sounds cool, at least cooler than tailed." Ojiro sighed, not noticing Izuku's sudden change in demeanor. "That's not true. The quirk might be simple, but you can do so much with it. How much can you lift with it? How well can you control it? How durable is your tail?" Izuku continued his chatter without looking Ojiro in the eye, took out his notebooks again and began to write intensely. Ojiro was taken aback and remained in stunned silence for a few moments, watching as the boy continued his rapid-fire speech without pausing for a full 20 seconds. It seemed as though he hadn't even stopped to take a breath. Another 20 seconds went by and Izuku was still talking, which now greatly worried Ojiro. Without realizing it, he attempted to interrupt the boy. Hey, he said, snapping his fingers in front of Izuku's eyes and attempting to block his view with his hands. But it was as if Izuku wasn't really looking at his notebook, his hands automatically moving to keep up with his speech. Ojiro then took hold of Izuku's hands, attempting to prevent him from continuing to write. Izuku's head shot up, realizing how long he had been talking. He blushed in embarrassment as he apologized to Ojiro. "I'm sorry, I mumbled again, didn't I? It's just that quirks fascinate me so much and I can't help but talk about them," he explained. Ojiro chuckled and reassured him, "No worries, man. I was just afraid you'd pass out from lack of oxygen, the way you were talking nonstop." Izuku couldn't help but let out a nervous laugh. "Yeah, I tend to get carried away sometimes," he admitted. Ojiro's gaze then shifted towards the notes Izuku had written. "So, what did you write about?" he asked curiously. "Oh, those are just some ideas I had about things you could do with your quirk. But since I don't have all the information, they're probably just wild guesses," Izuku explained, his voice trailing off as he became more uncertain. He had never been asked by someone his age about his notes on their quirks before. As he listed off his theories, Ojiro looked at him with a puzzled expression. Spinning. Catapult. Flight, he repeated, his tone questioning. Izuku's face turned red with embarrassment. I thought maybe you could spin your tail so fast that you could take off, he muttered, avoiding Ojiro's gaze. Ojiro stared at him for a moment before his expression suddenly broke into a smile and then a laugh. Like Tails from Sonic, he exclaimed, amused by the thought. Izuku's blush deepened. Not exactly what I had in mind, but yeah, something like that, he admitted, feeling foolish. He continued to chuckle. Can you imagine me flying with my tail spinning like a propeller, he said, still laughing. But when he noticed Izuku's downcast expression, he immediately sobered up. Hey, is everything okay, he asked, concerned. Izuku hesitated for a moment before blurting out, I'm sorry, I'm late for dinner, and then quickly ran away, leaving Ojiro alone on the beach. Was it something I said? After spending several days cooped up in his house, Izuku's thirst for knowledge became unquenchable. Even after his mother discovered all the broken cups in his room and forbade him from conducting experiments, he couldn't resist his curiosity. With shaky knees, he returned to the beach, choosing a different spot to avoid running into anyone. He scanned the area to ensure he was alone before taking out his notebook once more. But just as he began to write, he heard the familiar sound of Grimm's emergence. Despite sensing his presence, Izuku looked up to see Grimm standing beside him. His gaze remained fixed on Grimm, unsure and hesitant. Izuku's mind was racing, unsure of what to make of the situation. It felt like something was off, buried deep in his thoughts and only now surfacing. With a calm mind, he couldn't help but ponder over how peculiar Grimm truly was. While his appearance could be attributed to his quirk, Izuku had seen many individuals, including heroes, with mutations that didn't add anything to their abilities. It was everything else about Grimm that fascinated him. He was an ever-present companion, appearing out of thin air in places he shouldn't even know about, but always by Izuku's side. No one else could see him, and he possessed a second quirk that was vastly different from his first, leading Izuku to question whether it was truly a dual quirk at all. Dual quirks typically had some connection or similarity, yet sound storage, invisibility, and warping, an incredibly advanced form of it, seemed unrelated. Izuku couldn't fathom how it was possible without causing biological chaos, and it remained an enigma to him. Not to mention his ability to apparently read minds, at least Izuku's thoughts, how else could it be explained that Grimm knew what Izuku was up to with him? Every time he wanted something, Grimm would get it for him without him having to say anything. Every request he made of him, he dutifully fulfilled. This made Izuku think, and a dark chasm formed in his stomach. Raise your left arm, was what he wanted. It wasn't thought out loud or in his head, it was like he was moving a third appendage. Ojiro would probably approve of that metaphor. Grimm raised his left arm. Izuku's dark stomach pit grew. Go. Grimm walked. No. I am Izuku Midoriya, he said. But not out of his own mouth. Grimm's mouth moved for him, the sound came from his throat. Tears formed in his eyes and Izuku Midoriya wept. Go away. Grimm flew towards him again like that night. He now knows why. In a silent way. Izuku mused absent-mindedly during his math class. His quirk was always present, but in a silent way. Grimm wasn't a separate entity watching over him, Grimm was Izuku. It was his own quirk. He should have been overjoyed to have a quirk that could potentially make him a hero, but instead, Izuku felt a profound sense of emptiness. His only companion was himself, always. No wonder people would call him insane or crazy. The lessons finished, school was over, he was essentially talking to himself. He walked without thinking, not that they ever thought of something else, but Izuku at least always thought he was talking to someone who was real. His nose picked up an unpleasant stench, but he ignored it. He didn't care if he was just a fragment of his psyche, his earlier statements going through his mind. He knew it was different thinking about a scenario and having the scenario played out. And yet, he couldn't be less surprised as someone who didn't know. Even with shoes on, he felt the sand beneath him and he didn't know how to proceed. What should he do now? He had been given a quirk, his mental health had been badly affected and he had lost his only friend. A sigh escaped his mouth. Midoriya, a voice asked from behind, a familiar voice. Izuku immediately tensed and looked around. Takoba Beach. How did he get here? He turned quickly and found himself facing Ojiro again. Only this time he was wearing a green shirt and blue shorts with red shoes. Hey, do you remember me? I'm Ojiro, he greeted Izuku with an uncertain smile, pointing to himself with his thumb. Izuku, standing tensely, nodded quickly in recognition. Good to see you, Ojiro rambled, unsure how to continue the conversation. As they stood there in silence, Izuku could sense that Ojiro was thinking about something, but he couldn't quite figure out what it was. He felt a sense of unease, desperate to escape the situation without offending him. He searched for a way to politely excuse himself, hoping to leave without causing any harm. Ojiro began hesitantly, "Listen, about last time, I'm sorry." His words trailed off lamely, leaving Izuku looking confused and unsure of what to say. "Huh?" Izuku responded, his posture slacking. "You just took off like that, with a lame apology at that. It was probably something I said, right?" Ojiro asked, now even more uncertain than before. He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding eye contact. "And no, it wasn't your fault." Izuku replied quickly, trying to reason. I don't know." Izuku's mouth closed again, unsure of how to answer. "Why, you see," he said, his voice trembling. "It was my fault." Izuku quickly shook his head. No, he replied, his voice even more heated. He slumped back down, looking meek and defeated, gazing at the sand. The tension between them was palpable, and both teens were unsure how to proceed. But then Izuku took a deep breath and whispered, "Have you ever been lied to so well that after it turned out to be a lie, your whole world shattered?" Ojiro listened carefully, his expression growing more concerned. "Not really," he said uncertainly. "What exactly do you mean?" Izuku stammered, struggling to put his thoughts into words. "Well, your quirk, for one," he said, his voice rising in frustration. "What if one day it turned out you didn't have a tail as a quirk? What if you actually had wings, and the tail was only there because you were still growing into them?" He trailed off, realizing how ridiculous he sounded. "What would you do then?" he finished lamely. The boy with the tail appeared perplexed, scratching his cheeks thoughtfully as his tail rested on his left shoulder. "Well," he began, "first of all, I'd be devastated. Taily and I have been inseparable since the day I was born. Losing it, no matter what I get in return, would destroy me," he said firmly, chuckling at the nickname he had given to his tail. Izuku looked down, anticipating this answer. "But then, I suppose I would try out my new wings," he continued, looking up with a smile. "I mean, at least I would get something in return," he said, gazing up at the sky where a few seagulls were soaring. "And hey, flying doesn't seem so bad, right?" He looked back at Izuku, who stared at him in awe. "Why yes, it doesn't sound so bad," Izuku muttered, still amazed by the boy's positive outlook. Ojiro frowned, concerned at the teenager's somber tone. "Did something like that happen to you?" Izuku averted his eyes. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry." Silence returned once more. "Hey, a new Italian restaurant opened up a few streets away," he gestured behind him and Izuku looked up, surprised by the sudden change of topic. "Would you like to go there with me next Saturday?" Ojiro asked, his tone hopeful but unsure. Izuku's mind whirled. Had he just been asked to do something with him? Something like a friendship thing? He was so surprised that he didn't answer for a few seconds, which made Ojiro uncomfortable with the renewed silence. "You don't have to if you don't want to," he quickly added, backpedaling. But before he could say more, Izuku blurted out, No, I will." His face flushed with embarrassment, but he couldn't help the smile that crept across his lips. Ojiro fell silent before a smile spread across his face. "Great, next Saturday then." Izuku nodded. "Looking forward to it," he hollered as he ascended the stairs and waved goodbye. Izuku watched as Ojiro walked a few feet before stopping and sprinting back. "I almost forgot, we should probably exchange numbers," he muttered, chuckling. "Ok." A few minutes later, as Ojiro disappeared into the horizon, Izuku watched him go before turning his gaze to the sea. Despite the rubbish surrounding him, he took a deep breath of salty air and closed his eyes. The sound of seagulls made him lift his head to the sky and a small smile spread across his lips. "Yeah," he finally said to himself, "flying doesn't sound so bad." Izuku's hands twitched anxiously as he sat in the cramped waiting room of the quirk admissions office. He glanced around, taking in the sterile environment, the white leather sofa, polished to a high shine, situated on the opposite side of the room. A poster of a fluffy kitten hung next to the entrance he had just walked through. The faint scent of deodorant wafted from a person sitting a few chairs down. The room seemed frozen in time, unchanged since Izuku's last visit 2 years prior. "Third time's the charm, huh?" he silently asked himself. He couldn't help but feel a little discouraged, but he reminded himself that he wasn't alone, most people only had to come in twice. The first time was to register their quirk, and the second was to update its name after discovering more about it. It was all for the sake of the government's database, which required accurate information on all registered quirks. Izuku's mother's heart was pounding in her chest as she sat beside her son, her anxiety palpable. She had been surprised and relieved when her son had confided in her about Grimm, thankful that her son wasn't imagining things or making friends with someone she couldn't see. But as he talked about his theory of discovering his true quirk, her worry grew. And now, learning that Grimm was his quirk all along, a quirk that didn't match their family's or his father's, her heart sank with fear and concern for her son's well-being. She glanced over at him and noticed he was once again scribbling in his notebook. He often returned home with a pained expression and attempted to force a smile, but it was obvious he was struggling. She didn't want to intrude on his privacy, so she refrained from asking too many questions. Occasionally, however, when her concern became too great, she would take a quick glance or listen in on his murmurs as he talked about the mysterious man and his peculiar quirk. It was evident to her that having someone made him incredibly happy, but it also saddened her to see that he was so broken that his only companion was himself. Izuku was so engrossed in his thoughts that he didn't notice his mother's concerned expression. He was staring at the list of potential names for his quirk, lost in deep contemplation. He couldn't settle for just any name. Telekinesis wasn't only wrong, it didn't even begin to capture the full extent of his power. He knew that sound storage was a more fitting name, but even that fell short of encompassing the entirety of his abilities, especially the peculiar Grimm. After a metallic sound, Grimm appeared on Izuku's left side, facing forward. Izuku gazed at the apparition, longing for it to turn and face him. It was still strange to him that he had never realized how effortless it was to control Grimm. The ease of it all amazed him, like breathing or walking, and yet Grimm still seemed to have some form of independence from him. This gave him a glimmer of hope, that perhaps Grimm wasn't really his quirk, but another person aiding him. As he glanced over his list, a sense of disappointment washed over Izuku. He had hoped that Grimm was more than just a figment of his imagination, but those hopes were fading fast. With a heavy sigh, he turned back to his notebook and began crossing out the hastily scribbled names he had brainstormed over the past few days. It was clear to him now that none of them truly captured the essence of his unique ability. He knew he needed to put more thought into it, but he was struggling to find inspiration. As he was flipping through the pages of his notebook, Izuku was startled by the gentle shaking of his left shoulder. His mother's voice sounded soft in his ear, "Izuku, it's your turn." With a start, he closed his book, stood up, and followed the secretary who held the door open for him. Izuku walked quietly behind the secretary. "This is your third time, right, Izuku?" the secretary asked without looking back. He nodded, realizing too late that she couldn't see him. "Why yes," he stuttered, speaking a bit louder than intended. The secretary let out a small sigh before stopping in front of the familiar blue door and opening it. "Let's hope this is the last time, huh?" she said, forcing a polite smile. Izuku stared at her for a moment before quickly entering the room. The office room they entered was well lit by natural light streaming in from a large window on the left side. The walls were painted in a calming shade of blue and adorned with motivational posters and certificates. The room was relatively small, with only a desk, a few chairs, and a filing cabinet taking up most of the space. The desk was cluttered with papers and files, with a computer monitor and keyboard pushed off to the side. The air in the room was a bit stuffy, with a faint scent of cleaning products mixed with the musky smell of old paper. Overall, the room gave off a serious and professional vibe, making Izuku feel even more nervous than he already was. The door creaked open, and a tall man stepped in. He was broad-shouldered and stood with a confident posture, his head held high. He wore a well-tailored brown coat that accentuated his muscular build, and a neatly pressed white shirt peeked out from underneath. A pair of wire-rimmed gray glasses sat on his nose, giving him an intellectual air. His warm brown eyes scanned the room, and a small smile played on his lips as he spoke in a polite and friendly tone. "Izuku Midoriya?" he asked, his voice deep and resonant. Izuku's face grew more confused as he tried to place the man's friendly demeanor. "All right, I'm Shishibe Dirakume, and I'll take care of changing your quirk name, Izuku," he introduced himself before walking around the desk and taking a seat in front of them. Izuku's nerves got the best of him as he hesitantly spoke up, Dirakume-san, may I ask you something?" Shishibe's lips curved into a warm smile. "Certainly, and call me Shishibe," he said in a friendly tone, his eyes glinting with kindness. "I was just wondering, where is Shojibe-san?" Izuku asked, his voice wavering slightly. Shojibe had been the one to assist him with his quirk the last 2 times he had visited, and while he wasn't the most affable person, he had treated Izuku with a certain level of respect and professionalism. Shishibe's smile faltered slightly. Unfortunately, my colleague Shojibe is currently unavailable due to a cold, so I'll be taking care of your request today. I hope that's not a problem, he explained, his tone apologetic. Izuku shook his head quickly. No, not at all. I appreciate you taking the time to help me. Excellent, Shishibe said with a nod, his smile returning. Let's get started, then. He walked over to a cabinet and rummaged through it before returning to his desk with a file in hand. According to your file, you were considered quirkless until you were 8, when you registered your quirk as telekinesis. Is that correct? He asked, setting the file down. Izuku nodded in agreement. All right, so you wish to change the name of your quirk after discovering it's different from what you initially thought? Shishibe confirmed, leaning back in his chair. Izuku nodded again. Well then, let's hear it. What do you want to name your quirk? Shishibe said, his eyes lighting up with curiosity. Should I state my quirk? Izuku asked, sounding confused. While that's the usual way of doing things, I don't believe it's effective. Your quirk is a lifelong companion, and if you give it a name without much thought, you may not feel a sense of ownership towards it. That's why people often choose to rename their quirks, Shishibe explained, pointing his finger towards Izuku. Izuku pondered for a moment before responding, okay, if that's all right with you. Shishibe chuckled, besides, I enjoy trying to guess my patient's quirks. It's quite amusing. Izuku nodded, his notebook already in hand. He flipped to the page with the names he had brainstormed, then answered uncertainly, my first idea was sound storage. Shishibe stroked his chin thoughtfully. While it does describe your main ability and gives people a basic idea of what your quirk can do you think it truly represents you? He asked, fixing his gaze on Izuku. Izuku shifted nervously. He knew the answer was no, but he didn't want to waste any more of Shishibe's time. But Izuku hesitated before speaking. He remembered what Shishibe had said about naming his quirk half-heartedly. Ownership. It's mine. My quirk, he thought to himself. A small, quiet sound escaped him as he called forth something deep within him. Suddenly, the translucent left arm of Grimm appeared out of his own, hovering slightly over it like a gauntlet. As he traced it up his arm, it became more and more translucent until it vanished entirely. No, I don't think it does, Izuku finally said, meeting Shishibe's gaze with determination. Shishibe smiled knowingly before nodding in understanding. Take your time, Izuku. There's no need to rush, Shishibe said kindly, eyeing Izuku's notebook. Maybe I can take a look at what you wrote? Izuku instinctively clutched his notebook tighter. He didn't trust anyone with his ideas, not even his mother, and despite Shishibe's kindness, he couldn't bring himself to hand it over. It's okay, Izuku, Shishibe said, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. We can try something else. You must have heard the sound before, he asked, trying to find a different angle. Huh? Izuku looked confused, not sure where this was going. To activate your quirk, you must have heard the sound before, Shishibe explained. Oh, no, not really, Izuku replied, feeling a little confused. Shishibe paused and put on a thinking pose. So you store the sounds inside of objects, is that correct? He asked. Izuku nodded hesitantly, wondering where this was going. Shishibe leaned forward, and you can only store specific sounds, right? Izuku nodded again, feeling a little more confident. Well, I've actually only tried out a few, he admitted. Shishibe smiled encouragingly. Tell me about them. What sounds have you stored? Excitement washed over Izuku as he flipped open his notebook and began to share his discoveries with Shishibe. He eagerly recounted his experiments with the many microwaves he had found on Takoba Beach, describing in detail the different sounds he had used on them, smash, crash, boing, whoosh, and various other variations. Shishibe listened attentively, asking the occasional question for clarification, and never interrupting Izuku's flow of thought. After Izuku finished, Shishibe was quite taken aback. That's quite a quirk you've got there, Izuku. I'm impressed, he smiled. Izuku blushed heavily, not being used to the praise. Well then, do you perhaps have some obscure names? Izuku looked at the doctor in confusion. I've noticed that sometimes you interrupt your explanations and flip to another page just to scribble something away, he explained. Well those aren't really good names. He said lamely. But maybe they're good inspiration for a good name. Come on, I won't judge, he said jokingly. Izuku's left hand, which had been clutching his knee, was now fidgeting. He glanced again at one of the names he had crossed out before muttering something quietly. In a silent way. What was that? I didn't hear it, Shishibe said, leaning closer. In a silent way, repeated Izuku again, this time louder and easier to hear. Oh, how did you come up with that name? Izuku looked to the ground again and fell silent once more. Shishibe leaned back in his chair again, giving Izuku time to think. My quirk allows me to summon an invisible humanoid. It can store sounds, not me. Oh, a sentient quirk then, the doctor asked curiously. No, not really. Izuku quickly dispelled, it's semi-sentient, it knows what I want without me having to explain myself, and listens to my command. But it can't speak. But I can speak through it. Shishibe stared at Izuku for a few seconds, causing him to shift back and forth in his seat. What a unique quirk. And you say it's invisible, he asked in confirmation? Izuku nodded. Why yes, to everyone but me, it's invisible. That's why people thought I had telekinesis when I asked it to get me something and they couldn't see it. Again there was silence. Fascinating. The doctor whispered, but because of the silence in the office, Izuku could hear it. And how is it that you chose that name for it? Well, Izuku looked uncertain. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, Izuku, Shishibe quickly reassured. Izuku quickly shook his head, and no, it's fine. The reason was, because I was diagnosed quirkless. When I first saw my quirk, I thought he was someone who protected me. Who was always there, a friend to me. The more Izuku spoke, the more conviction there was in his voice. When I spoke to it, it didn't answer. It just stared and listened. When I found out it wasn't someone else, it was my quirk. I realized it was always with me. Just in a silent way. He whispered at the end. Shishibe looked at Izuku again, and because the sounds it can store and emit are silent to everyone. It's a bit ironic that it does that. He stuttered. Shishibe continued to be silent. Izuku, Shishibe said softly, capturing the young boy's attention. Have you ever tried calling out the name of your quirk while using it? Izuku looked puzzled, and Shishibe quickly explained, in stressful situations, people often call out the name of their quirk as a way to calm their mind. It's a coping mechanism for dealing with the pressure of not being able to use their quirk without a license. Izuku remained calm but uncertain. Is it worth a try? He asked tentatively. Shishibe nodded. It could be helpful. Give it a shot. In a silent way. Directly behind Izuku, his full form emerged, his grin seeming to widen even more and his eyes shining with a bright light. Izuku felt a sense of exhilaration and contentment, as if he had discovered something special within himself. Well? Shishibe asked with a knowing smile. Yes. Izuku cried out. He couldn't explain it, it just felt good, right? All right then, Shishibe said, standing up as well. I'll take care of the paperwork, it should be official tomorrow, the doctor smiled. What a fancy name. After a few more minutes, Izuku left the building, dragging his mother behind him. His quirk, he looked down at his hand, which was instead covered by a ghostly hand. He formed it into a fist and smiled. His own quirk. His own power. He could become a hero. Name. Shishibe Diracume. Quirk. Zone out. Description. Produces a low amount of unnoticeable pheromones that leave through his skin. Inhalation of these makes the affected more relaxed and in a calm state of mind the longer they are in contact with the pheromones. Izuku sat on a rusty fridge, his eyes fixed on the vast expanse of the blue sea, at least as best he could with all the rubbish in the way, and waited silently for Ojiro. Both were quite busy after their visit to the Italian restaurant. Ojiro, who was taking a martial arts class, had a tournament and Izuku renamed his quirk but decided they should do something together again. Neither were sure what to do before they agreed to just walk around the mall. His thoughts were momentarily distracted by the sound of footsteps approaching him. Looking up, he saw Ojiro making his way towards him, a small smile on his face. Hey, Izuku, Ojiro said as he reached him. Sorry I'm late. Izuku shook his head, his attention returning to the sea. It's fine. I was just thinking. Ojiro followed his gaze out to the water, and his expression softened. Yeah, it's kind of peaceful out here, isn't it? Izuku nodded, grateful for the company. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the soothing sound of the waves crashing against the shore. Eventually they departed from the trash beach, walking to the city. How was the tournament? I'm sorry I couldn't be there, Izuku said nervously. It's okay, he waved his hands as if to wipe away Izuku's worries. It was just bad luck that your appointment fell on the same day. Izuku, still feeling bad but not really wanting to argue with him, simply nodded. As they walked, a comfortable silence settled between them. They strolled through the busy streets, occasionally peering into shop windows along the way towards the station. The bustling city was alive with the sounds of people, traffic, and the occasional street performer. As they stood on the platform, waiting for their train to arrive, Ojiro turned to Izuku with a smile. "So," he asked. "What?" asked Izuku nervously. Ojiro couldn't help but chuckle at Izuku's nervousness. He remembered the last time they were out together, Izuku had trouble even ordering for himself and had to repeat his words twice. It was a relief to see him improving, and Ojiro found the whole situation a little endearing. "Your quirk name? What is it now?" he clarified for him. "Aya." Izuku remained silent. Honestly, he didn't know why he thought that name was such a good idea. No, actually it was because deep inside he had a resonance or something similar. He just knew it, but somehow the trust he had in Shishibe was much lower, so he was almost embarrassed by the name because it was so unconventional. As he mulled over his thoughts, Ojiro noticed his friend's unease. "Hey, you all right?" he asked, his concern evident. Izuku hesitated before finally responding, "I named my quirk," in a silent way. His voice trailed off, unsure of how Ojiro would handle the situation. Izuku remained silent. But to his surprise, Ojiro's face lit up with excitement. "Dude, that's so cool," he exclaimed, causing Izuku to blink in surprise. "Ah, really?" he stammered, unsure of how to react. "Are you kidding? That's probably the coolest name I've heard for a quirk." Izuku felt a wave of relief wash over him, grateful for Ojiro's enthusiastic response. "Thanks," he replied quietly with a small smile, feeling more confident about his quirk's name. Ojiro's shoulder sagged a little. "I'd probably call it sound storage, or something simple like that." "Well, that would sum up the ability pretty well, wouldn't it?" encouraged Izuku. "Yeah, but," in a silent way, he let it roll off his tongue, "that's just so much better." The two friends continued their conversation, discussing the various quirk names of heroes and villains, laughing at some of the more ridiculous ones and sharing their personal favorites. It wasn't long before they reached the mall and took a tour, admiring the various shops and window displays. They chatted about their favorite stores and items, but eventually ran out of things to say. They fell into a comfortable silence, occasionally pointing out something interesting to each other as they strolled through the mall. As they walked, Ojiro recounted his recent martial arts tournament, his voice filled with disappointment over his defeat. Izuku listened attentively, gasping in all the right places and asking questions to show his interest. "But you made it to the final." "I probably wouldn't even make it past the first round," Izuku tried to comfort him. "Well, you have no martial arts training, no wonder," Ojiro chuckled. Still." Izuku protested with a pout, causing Ojiro to laugh nervously and blush. Eventually, they bought ice cream and sat down on a nearby bench to enjoy it. As they licked their cones, Izuku and Ojiro discussed their favorite hero and quirks, poking fun at a few of the more ridiculous ones. Time flew by quickly, and before they knew it, their phones alerted them that their train was about to arrive. They scrambled to finish their ice cream and ran through the mall to catch the train. They made it just in time, panting and laughing as they boarded. When they said their goodbyes and parted ways at the station, Izuku's face lit up with a genuine smile that stayed with him all the way home. Name: Mashireo Ojiro. Quirk: Tail. Description: he has a very flexible, durable and several times denser tail on his back that he can move instinctively. Izuku went to the beach more often than he admitted to his mother. Not because he liked it. On the contrary, he didn't really like being on that beach, but he enjoyed the privacy he had there to train with his quirk instead of using one of the many quirk training centers. Quirk training centers were supposed to be a place where you could learn to control your quirk without a license. However, the reality was that these centers often fell short. For starters, there was a monthly fee, which seemed reasonable, but it was strange that citizens had to pay to use a facility that was technically owned by the government. Izuku couldn't help but wonder about the economics behind it. Furthermore, these centers collected an alarming amount of data on their users. From the numerous forums he had read before seeing if he should sign up, it was clear that users were treated like guinea pigs. They were only allowed to experiment with their quirks if the centers approved, and some even trained small children with promising quirks to become heroes. To Izuku, this seemed too extreme to be true, and he typically ignored such statements, but still worried that still many agreed on the first part. He decided against a membership. But it wasn't as if he needed the center, he had the perfect place to train without anyone else knowing. If he broke the law somehow, no one would catch him. He looked around nervously. No one. He continued to obliterate the microwaves. He had become quite good at that with his quirk. The old-fashioned way with the fist? Ojiro's question randomly entered his head. Now that he thought about it, he could try it, couldn't he? Crunch. Izuku really concentrated on not crying. A few moments later, after he had given himself a slap in the face for this really impulsive act, he tried it again. Finding the familiar feeling only slightly compelling, he formed a ghostly fist around his own. It was only a skeletal hand, covered by a glove, but perhaps it would not hurt as much? Clank, it did. Not as much as it would have been without it, but he certainly couldn't destroy a wall or this microwave with his fist alone. Not like Ojiro, who showed the strength of his tail after much urging from Izuku. Izuku looked at the device again. 2 kanas covered it from the front, 1 blue, 1 red. He touched them and like the last time, it was squeezed, not giving much resistance as Izuku used more force in his finger to penetrate it and form around it instead. When he let go, it really was like a trampoline, releasing the energy it had stored and quickly returning to its former form. I wonder? Izuku left the sandy ground in exchange for the clean, pure concrete before taking off his shoes and throwing them on the ground. Checking, they both had blue kanas for smash on their soles. He put them back on, being careful not to let the kanas touch the ground, and used the railing to get back up on his hands, standing on his toes so as not to touch the ground. He slowly climbed up the railing, then used it to jump as high as he could into the air, landing with his shoes on the side street. A very loud cracking sound was the first thing he heard before he realized that he had fallen further to the ground. Izuku was shocked at first, before the shock turned to horror. Oh no. He was standing in a 30-centimeter deep hole he had dug himself, cracks around the hole spreading like a spider's web. He quickly climbed out of the hole and examined it from above. Maybe it's not as bad as it looks? It was definitely as bad as it looks. It was like Small Mite came through and randomly punched the ground at that spot, twice. It's probably fine. When he comes back tomorrow, it will be gone. Finally, he ran fast enough to create zoom effects that he applied to the soles of his shoes, making him faster and the newly created zoom effects even stronger. The next day it was still there. Izuku started to panic. This was bad, very bad. He wished it was just a dream. Just a dream in which he had accidentally committed property damage. No, wait, it actually belongs to the state. Does that still count? Probably, not that he wouldn't be just as freaked out if it didn't. He nervously bounced around the hole, patting himself every now and then to make sure it was very much real. Well, he could at least make sure no one fell in? Yes, that sounded like a good idea. He immediately set to work summoning Gree in a silent way so it could scoop up some sand with its hands as well. Slowly, he filled up the whole hole with sand and placed a somewhat smooth metal sheet he had found on top of it. It was clearly visible, but at least no one would get their feet stuck in it if they walked carelessly. He went back to the sandy beach and continued to experiment with his sounds. The next few months were exciting for him. His little accident with the concrete proved fruitful and gave him the idea of using his stored sounds on himself, in the first place. So far, he had found that a smash sound on his fist could definitely destroy a microwave. And the metal wall of the refrigerator behind it. The zoom he had used instinctively before made him go fast. About 40 kilometers per hour was his maximum before he couldn't control his movements anymore and crashed into the nearest thing, in this case the sea, if he used it. He didn't want to put his bones to the test by crashing into a wall, so he mostly used it to reach an average speed of 15 kilometers per hour without losing his stamina. When Ojiro suggested using the sound effects as armor, the results were not favorable for the blonde teenager. If he used smash and hit the spot, he would simply be knocked away. With zoom, the same thing would happen, although Ojiro said it didn't feel like someone had punched him, but more like a strong wind had pushed him. Really hard. At crunch, for which Izuku sacrificed his hand by hitting the wall, Ojiro went down on his knees and clutched his freshly bruised hand in pain. Izuku felt the blows he was receiving, but it felt like there was a soft wall between him and the blow, canceling out some of the force behind the blow. It still hurt Izuku, especially when Ojiro struck with his tail instead of his fists, but it hurt much less. Another limitation he noticed was that he couldn't move the kanas on the object after they appeared there, although he could control whether they appeared on the floor where he hit the microwave or on the microwaves themselves. Name: Hisashi Midoriya. Quirk: Fire Breath. Description: able to breathe a hot stream of fire from his mouth. As a side effect, his respiration system, mouth and face area are all fire resistant. Record for consistent stream of fire, 23 seconds. For years later. So I guess I will meet you at the beach again? Mashireo's voice asked through Izuku's phone. Yep, probably going to be a bit late. I still need to change my clothes. Izuku replied. I will see you there then. The line went silent as Izuku pocketed his phone in his school bag again before leaving school grounds and making his way home. It's been 4 years now since he extensively trained with his quirk. And also 4 years since he befriended Mashireo, something he was extremely grateful for. Despite vastly different hobbies, both of them seemed to get along too well, almost always forgetting the time when they talked or trained together with their quirks. Through him he even met Itsuka Kendo, another student in the same dojo as Mashireo, although he didn't know her too well, having her join them on their weekly hang-out trips 7 times in total. Sure, his contact list might only be 5 names long, not counting Kaken, but he didn't really need more friends. Although it was kinda lonely now when Mashireo didn't have time for him. Despite the small inconvenience of craving social interaction with his best friends, his mental health has significantly improved, his stutter problem almost gone except in front of a hero. Mashireo tried to help him with that, ultimately he couldn't without invoking a villain attack to let Izuku actually speak with the heroes. And in front of girls who are not named Itsuka Kendo. Something Itsuka tried to help with by introducing him to her friends, which ultimately resulted in Izuku having a meltdown and not responding to anyone for the rest of the day. Understandable in Mashireo's eyes if her friends didn't seem to know what personal space meant. I'm home. The door to his apartment seemed to open from itself, but he actually sent IAS through the door to open it. Something that he discovered he could do when he locked himself out of his own home because he forgot his keys and his mother wasn't home. An act of desperation honestly, but Izuku likes to call it fate. It had a nicer ring to it. Ah, Izuku, the shape of his mother greeted him. A lot has happened in her son's life, and seemingly all of them were good for her little baby. He smiled more, and none of them were forced. He frequently invited his friend over, which made her cry the first time the polite blonde boy stood before her door, and her son even had a strong quirk. The last thought made her smile, directed at her son, who was entering his room to change into a more comfortable thing, drop. Her son's quirk was something they actually rarely talked about. It was almost like a taboo in their household to not ask too many questions how his son got a quirk, according to her son, right after they visited the doctor. More curiously, a quirk that had nothing to do with any of their family's history. Inko knew about the mutation. The doctor, after analyzing Izuku, explained to her that a child may develop a completely unrelated quirk from their parents, but to have a completely unrelated quirk from their whole family made her really doubtful. She went back into the kitchen. If the soup were to be ruined because of her own internal musing, she would never forgive herself. In the end, she didn't really worry about the origin of her son's quirk. She worried more about his future. She hated herself in knowing a tiny part of her was relieved that her son couldn't become a hero. In her heart she knew that it was just too dangerous becoming one without a quirk. Her son had it hard enough in the world without a quirk, him wanting to become a hero, even after his quirk lessons, made her only worry more. But every time she looked into his face, into her son's face, she just couldn't. She just couldn't tell him that she didn't believe in him, that she wished he would stay safe, choose a non-dangerous occupation, and let her heart stop beating like a drum every time a villain attack was in their city, knowing that her son couldn't defend himself. She pulled out a knife. It was time to add the onions. Not only was his new quirk perfect for heroics, his creativity made the already strong quirk into something even above her. Half of the things Izuku told her he did every time he visited the beach, something she tried to stop him before ultimately just telling to be careful, would never even cross her mind. I'm going out for a while. Is it okay for Mashireo to eat with us? Her son asked, having already opened the door. Why, yeah, you can invite your friend over. Inko sniffed, trying to avoid the onion juices as much as possible. Thanks, Mom. The door closed and Inko was alone again. Now Inko was at a loss for options. There was no real reason why her son couldn't become a hero, why he couldn't live his dream. There was no reason why she couldn't believe in him, believe in her son to become a hero. Only the worries of a mother stopped her from fully accepting her son's dreams. Not for the first time, tears were streaming down Inko's eyes, the onions already added to the soup a long time ago. Name: Inko Midoriya. Quirk: attract. Description: she has the ability to attract small objects to her with a hand motion. After waiting for about an hour, Izuku finally showed up at their designated meeting place. As usual, the overwhelming stench of garbage assaulted Izuku's nose, but it quickly dissipated. He had grown accustomed to the smell over time. Upon surveying the growing piles of rubbish, Izuku couldn't help but furrow his brows in displeasure. He suggested to his friend that they should clean up the beach, but they quickly dismissed the idea. They didn't know where to dispose of the vast amount of garbage, and the nearest rubbish bin was a daunting 200 meters away. They were also clueless about how to handle bulky appliances, such as the refrigerator, that were too big to fit into the bin. Despite the messy surroundings, they managed to find a nice spot to train and kept it clean. Mashirao even created some garbage statues of himself, which, in Izuku's opinion, resembled a comical dinosaur with an odd head. As Izuku approached his friend, who was standing in the middle of the serene, unspoiled sea view, Mashirao turned to greet him. "Ah, Izuku," he said with a smile, "I was starting to think you weren't going to show up." Izuku chuckled in response, "As if I'd missed the chance to kick your butt." Mashirao chuckled along with him before leading the way to a makeshift table they had fashioned, complete with an old alarm clock sitting on top. Mashirao grumbled as he set the timer on the old alarm clock to 5 minutes. "It's such a bummer that we can't do this more often now," he lamented. "What did you expect? We're in our final year, Mashirao." "It's not supposed to be a cakewalk," Izuku retorted, walking towards the other side of the wide ring they had marked on the sand with plastic bottles. "Yeah, but I didn't anticipate having to study more for the UA entrance exam than for my current exams," Mashirao sighed before taking his place on the opposite side of the ring, facing Izuku. "This is a great way to blow off some steam, though, don't you think?" "Humph, I'm always ready," Izuku replied, his voice brimming with excitement. He took a single stone out of his pocket and threw it high into the air. The two teenagers locked eyes, and everything outside the ring blurred and became out of focus as their attention was solely focused on their opponent. The stone soared to its highest point before plummeting to the ground at an impressive speed. 3, 2, 1. Thud. Mashirao soared through the air, propelled by his flexible and powerful tail that he used to slam the ground with, hurtling towards Izuku. The green-haired teen was already on the move, racing towards the stone he had thrown earlier and sending IAS ahead of him to retrieve it. The tailed boy, seeing Izuku's plan, quickly spun in midair, using his tail as a heavy point to increase his centrifugal force and plummeting straight down towards IAS. Unbeknownst to him, IAS had already returned to Izuku, who had continued sprinting forward and delivered a swift punch to his midriff and left leg as Mashirao landed perfectly on his feet, sending sand flying everywhere and the stone Izuku was chasing behind him. Without missing a beat, Mashirao spun again, using the momentum to hit Izuku in his stomach with his tail. It immediately got repelled back, almost slamming into him, if he didn't stop it in time. Izuku, who was now backing up, released a breath of air forcefully, creating a small blue huff kana from his mouth, sending it flying towards Mashirao. As soon as it made contact with him, his lungs forcefully expelled the stored air in it, causing him to stumble and stagger for a moment. But Izuku wasn't done yet. He followed up with a powerful punch, conjuring a smash kana on Mashirao's chest. Then, with lightning-fast reflexes, IAS threw another stone at the kana, causing it to activate and send him hurtling backwards, landing a good distance away from Izuku on his back. Mashirao stood back up, gritting his teeth as he wiped the sand off his face. He glared at Izuku, who was still grinning with excitement. "New sound effect?" questioned the blonde teen, trying to catch his breath. "Just got it yesterday by accident," yelled Izuku before clapping his hands together. Clap! Before Mashirao could resume his sprint, Izuku slammed his hand on the ground, causing the sand around the kana to rise high, obscuring his form. Mashirao tried to locate him, but the sand was too thick. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in his liver and quickly rotated, using his tail as a makeshift morning star to defend himself. He cursed under his breath, knowing that it must have been IAS. He took a moment to catch his breath, using the time to assess the situation. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins as he prepared for the next attack. Without hesitation, Mashirao charged forward, using his tail to launch himself into the air. As he flew through the sand, he felt the wind whipping through his hair, removing some of the sand in his hair. He saw Izuku's form through the sand and aimed a swift kick at him. Before he could, a stone flew toward his leg, impacting with his form, resulted with him losing all momentum he got, falling back to the ground where Izuku was already staying. As Izuku prepared to use his sound attack again, a sudden jolt of pain shot through his eyes, forcing them shut. He winced and rubbed his eyes, struggling to regain his vision. But before he could open them, he was hit with sharp blows to his left side and right leg, causing him to stumble backward. A moment later, a similar blow to his back sent him hurtling forward. Mashirao had used the sand on his body to obscure Izuku's vision, taking advantage of the situation to land some strong hits. He would have continued his assault, but an invisible punch to his stomach caused him to wince in pain. With panic setting in, Izuku unleashed a barrage of weak punches behind him using IAS, hoping to halt Mashirao's attack. He then rushed forward with his eyes still closed, jumping slightly before descending and turning back around. Whoosh! As he landed, he willed the stored sound to materialize on his hand. He slapped his hand over his eyes, feeling the sound clear away the sand and moisture. After blinking several times to clear his vision, Izuku realized that Mashirao was no longer in front of him. Mashirao had sacrificed his front to allow IAS's weak punches to land, but he had used the opportunity to maneuver behind Izuku. Izuku quickly realized where his opponent was and directed IAS to punch his back. He felt the kana squishing on his back right as it was created and a grunt of pain from Mashirao, confirming his location. However, as Izuku turned around to face his opponent, he was met with a searing pain on the side of his face. Mashirao had struck him with a powerful tail whip, not letting his negated attack stop him. Despite the pain, Izuku refused to give up. He tried to retaliate by kicking him to the side, but the tail was already rotating around to counter his attack. Another blow on his left leg, which didn't cause him pain but made him stumble backwards. Mashirao, whose tail got violently repelled by, he presumed, a smash on Izuku's left leg, quickly readjusted himself before charging again. While the counter from Mashirao was unsuccessful, the after effects of the head blow made Izuku's ears still ring, losing his sense of balance. It was all the second Mashirao needed to land another blow on his left leg, now causing pain and dropping Izuku to a knee. Before he could do anything, he was lifted by his friend who now rotated with him, gaining more and more speed. Uurarea! Mashirao's battle cry echoed in Izuku's ears, drowning out the ringing. Suddenly, he let go of Izuku, causing him to soar through the air and land on his back outside of the ring with a loud thud. Izuku lay there for a moment, catching his breath and trying to regain his senses. The pain in his leg throbbed, and his ears continued to ring. Wait, that wasn't his ears ringing. Putting in effort to turn his head towards the makeshift table, he could see that the 5 minutes were up, seeing his friend catching his breath on the edge of his vision. Mashirao took a few breaths, before walking towards Izuku and helping him stand. Said boy stood for a good 2 seconds before heavily leaning on Mashirao for support. Izuku's leg throbbed with each step as they descended the stairs. Man, I got you good huh? Asked Mashirao. His words were muffled by the ringing in his ears, making it difficult to concentrate. As they finally reached the top of the stairs, Izuku could feel his vision blurring, and he struggled to stay upright. I don't think I can make it, he muttered, feeling Mashirao's strong grip on his arm. Come on, hop on my back, his friend said firmly, crouching down. Izuku hesitated, but eventually, he allowed him to lift him onto his back. He winced as his friend's movements jarred his leg, causing a sharp pain to shoot through his body. Easy there, Izuku groaned, trying to keep his weight off his injured leg. Mashirao took the hint and adjusted his grip, making sure to support Izuku's weight more carefully. Then, with a grunt of effort, he began to carry Izuku towards his home. The journey was a blur of pain and discomfort, but eventually, they arrived at Izuku's doorstep. Mashirao set him down gently, and Izuku leaned heavily on the doorframe for support. Thanks, he muttered, feeling a sense of gratitude towards his friend. He smiled, but his expression was tinged with concern. Are you going to be okay? Izuku tried to reassure him that he was fine, despite the ringing in his ears and the pain in his leg. Come on, this isn't the worst I have experienced, he said with a weak smile. Mashirao couldn't help but shake his head in disbelief. Izuku was always pushing himself to the limit, and it worried him. The fact that it's true makes me even more worried, he replied, sighing. After a moment of silence, Izuku finally asked, how close was I? His sparring partner thought for a moment before answering. The few smashes got me good, and that barrage actually managed to hit my liver again. I think another hit to it and I would need to replace it, he said with a chuckle, causing Izuku to smile briefly before they both winced in pain. Suddenly, an ominous voice interrupted their conversation from behind. "And what, pray tell me, did you boys do again?" a motherly voice asked. Izuku and Mashireo froze, slowly turning around to face the source of the voice. It was the last person they wanted to see right now, Izuku's mother. "Didn't we have a talk already about this?" she asked sweetly, her smile belying the sternness in her voice. The boys could only nod dumbly in response. "Really? I think we need to have another talk then," she continued, her smile turning even sweeter. Izuku and Mashireo both shivered in dread. Name: Itsuka Kendo. Quirk: Big Fist. Description: she is able to almost instantaneously enlarge her hands into around 3 times her body size. Shoyuta Aizawa was having a gloomy day. As if the broken coffee machine in the teacher's lounge wasn't bad enough, which he suspected was Hisashi's fault, it was also raining. He hated rain. Well, not always. He enjoyed it when he could curl up in his cozy apartment with a hot mug of coffee and his cat on his lap. But any other time, he wished it would go away. Still, he had some reasons to smile. He felt a faint grin tug at his lips as he waited for his colleague to join him in the meeting room. One by one, the rest of the UA teachers filed into the spacious room and took their seats. Shoyuta quickly composed himself and hid his smile. The last and most important person arrived with a bang. Literally. There was a loud thud from the vents before a small white rodent dropped neatly onto his chair at the head of the table, holding a cup of what looked like tea. Shoyuta wondered if there was a kettle hidden in the vents, but he knew he would never find out. He was too big to fit in there. "I'm sure you're all curious about this sudden meeting." Nizu's cheerful voice cut through his thoughts. There were several nods and murmurs of agreement. "It's quite simple, really." Thanks to a persistent request, he glanced pointedly at Shoyuta, who shrugged it off, and after a long negotiation with the HPSC, "We've reached a consensus." Nizu stood up on his chair, raising his cup in the air. "The entrance exams for UA have been changed," he announced happily. Chaos ensued as everyone started asking questions. Shoyuta just leaned back in his seat, since he already knew everything about it. "Does that mean no more robots?" Maijima asked eagerly. "That's right. The new system will have no robots at all," Nizu confirmed. Shoyuta couldn't tell what Maijima was thinking behind the smile that was spreading on his face, but he didn't really care. He had more important things on his mind, like the brand of the instant coffee he had bought. He took another sip. Ah, that hit the spot. UA's entrance exam changed. He clicked on one of the links and read the article with wide eyes. According to the official statement from Nizu, UA's principal, its entrance exam will be changed for the first time in decades. It really didn't state more, except that a preliminary test will be hosted that decides if the entrance exam can be taken in the first place. The article also mentioned that the change was partly due to a request from one of UA's teachers, Shoyuta Aizawa, who had argued that the old system was unfair and biased towards certain types of quirks. No sooner did Izuku read the article to the end, his phone vibrated and a message from Mashireo. "Tails. Dude, have you seen the news?" Green. "About UA?" Tails. "Yeah, they are just changing the whole thing in our year." Green. "Is it so bad though? Maybe the new system would be better." Tails. "I doubt it can get better for us than smashing a few robo-heads." Green. "We don't know that yet. Maybe it actually is? You know what I bet it is." "Are you nervous?" a voice to his left asked, breaking his reverie. "And no. It's just theory, I can do this." Izuku protested, failing to sound confident. "You're stuttering," Mashireo pointed out. He felt a surge of anxiety as he gazed at the towering structure in front of him. The main building of UA. It was the dream of countless aspiring heroes, and he was about to take the first step towards it. They watched as other hopefuls passed by them, each with their own worries and expectations. "So, you are nervous?" Mashireo teased after a while, grinning at Izuku's reaction. He was actually just as nervous as Izuku. "Anyway," Izuku said, ignoring the mockery, and dashed ahead. Hey, wait for me," he heard his best friend call from behind him. But he didn't slow down. Until he stumbled on thin air. "Izuku, is this really happening right now?" Summoning instinctively in a silent way, he willed it to catch him by his neck, which it barely did. A sigh of relief came out of his mouth, and that of Mashireo, who finally caught up to him, before both looked in shock when a giant mushroom started growing before their eyes. "Oh, sorry," a small voice apologized. They turned to see a girl with long brown hair that covered her eyes. She looked shy and nervous, ready to bolt at any moment. Holy shit, a talking mushroom. Izuku had to suppress a snort at Mashareo's whisper. He wasn't entirely wrong. The girl's hair was so thick and round that it resembled a mushroom cap. "I saw you were going to fall, so I used my quirk to cushion your landing, but you didn't need it and now I feel silly," she said, her voice getting quieter and more uncertain with each word. She didn't get any reassurance from Izuku and Mashareo, who were still staring and gawking at her. "I'm sorry," she cried, and sprinted inside. The two teens stared at her vanishing form, before Mashareo helped Izuku get up, who was still held in midair. "You're okay? A girl just talked to me. Do I not count?" Izuku felt his heart stop as he jumped and wrapped his arms around Mashareo. "Keikendo? How long were you standing there?" Mashareo asked, surprised. "Just got here," she walked forwards before looking behind her. "Are you two going to keep standing there or actually take the exams?" she said before turning back around. They quickly looked at each other, Izuku letting go of the taller boy before they quickly followed the girl inside. A week later a letter found its way towards the Midoriya household. Sadly, both residents were out so nobody could read the content of the letter, sealed with the UA stemple. "Izuku Midoriya, we are pleased to inform you that you have successfully passed the preliminary exams for admission to UA High School. You have achieved a score of over 90% on the written test, which exceeds the minimum requirement of 75%. You are now eligible to take the entrance exams, which will consist of a series of physical challenges. The entrance exams will be held at UA High School on .xxxx at 8 a.m. Please find the enclosed details and instructions for the entrance exams. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact our secretary who will be happy to assist you. We look forward to seeing you soon. Sincerely, Nizu, Principal of UA. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please like, subscribe and support the original writer. See you in the next video?